This beginner's tutorial for middle level shop students is going to cover the Jig Saw, also known as the Saber Saw, how to use it, how to change blades, and different types you may find. So in this case, this one is cordless, it's battery operated. More commonly in a shop, you'll find one with a cord, which is just the standard electric Jig Saw or Saber Saw. So Jig Saws are very useful for cutting thin material, say plywood, up to 3/4 or so inch thick, and for making curved cuts. You can cut a variety of materials, including wood, metal, plastics, depending on the type of blade you have on here. Jig saws are not particularly great at making accurate straight cuts. You could run this along a fence on your board to make it easier to make a straight cut, but if you really need an accurate straight cut, you're better off using something like a circular saw, or if you have access to a table saw. So a jig saw, the blade cuts with what's known as a reciprocating or reciprocal motion. So as I squeeze the trigger, you'll see this go up and down. So the teeth on these typically point up. So in this case, with this blade, this does the majority of the cutting as the blade recoils up. Most jig saws are variable speed, meaning the more you pull the trigger, the faster the blade will cut. So if I begin slowly and then slowly increase the trigger pull, for most applications cutting, somewhere in that medium range speed is where you want to pull the trigger. I recommend you don't just start off, okay? Even though that might be fun, it's not going to give you an accurate cut. It'll actually make a much rougher cut and leave much larger splinters. So because that goes back and forth like that, the risk here, if I were to pull this trigger and the blade goes down and hits the bench top, this is going to bounce off and kick. That could most commonly break the blade. You could get hit by the saw though, and it could damage your workpiece. So we need to be aware of where that blade is. The other issue is when we're cutting something, if this was my board, we actually don't really see the blade because it's down inside the board and sticks out below. So we need to make sure we're really vigilant and aware of what's underneath, and we never want to be reaching underneath our cut because that blade is going to be extending out the other side. We are limited by the thickness of the material we can cut based on the shortest point this ever sticks out. So as this comes all the way up, I can't cut a board any thicker than that. Even though it will drop down on the downstroke, if it doesn't cut all the way through on the upstroke, we just can't cut a board that thick. So to change a blade on these, because in this case these are rather large teeth, this will make a fast but very rough cut. To swap the blade, first off I want to remove my power source. So in this case I'm going to unplug the battery, but if you had one with a cord, you definitely want to make sure you unplug that. You don't want to, because we have to handle this blade with our hand, we don't want to have any risk while we're holding it that this could start up. So I'm going to remove my battery here. Okay, now there's no chance of it doing anything. Now, depending on how old your saw is or the make or model, there are different ways to release the blade. Typically, most modern ones have a quick release here, so I can push up on this little trigger here. Usually it's pretty easy to find. An older model, you may need a screwdriver to loosen a screw in order to remove the blade. But typically, if you have something newer, we can just lift up on this trigger and slide the blade out. To install it, it's just the opposite. I need to lift up on the trigger. I'll slide this into the slot here. And then it's important to notice there's a little wheel right here. It's sort of a guide wheel on a bearing. And the blade needs to rest in the groove in that wheel. All right, there's enough play here, enough wiggle that it is possible to get it outside of that, but I need to make sure it's lined in that groove. And that's going to guide this, keep it straight as it goes up and down. Now, blades come in a whole variety. Typically you'll find sort of like a little index here with a variety of blades. It is common to use something with larger teeth for cutting wood, but as I mentioned, you can cut metal with these plastics, and so you want to make sure you're using the right type of blade. Typically a metal cutting blade will have much finer teeth, sort of like a hacksaw. Like this one. Very fine teeth, still pointing up towards the saw. You may find a thinner blade, a narrower blade this way. That would be for making even tighter curves and cuts. So there's a whole variety. If you have any question about which blade you should be using, check with your instructor. You will occasionally see a blade, not look like I have one here. Ah, here it is. Where the teeth actually point in the opposite direction. So the common orientation is the teeth point up towards the saw. In this case, they're pointing down to cut away and down. The applications for that are, in most cases, either one could work, but whichever direction the teeth point, as that comes out of the wood, it's going to leave a rougher cut on that side. So typically, as this blade is cutting with the teeth up towards the saw, the rough cut edge is going to be the side facing up towards you. If for some reason you needed to cut something and have the rough side away from you, like if you're cutting through a visible panel and you want the rough cut on the back side, you could use a blade like that where it's going to tear out on the other side. So to put this back in, pull up on the trigger, slide this into the slot, make sure it's in the guide wheel, plug my battery back in or my cord, and we're good to go. So let's cut something. I want to make sure what I'm cutting is securely in place. And now, if I am cutting, let's say, a curve like this, all right, I'm basically just going to follow that line on here, okay, with my blade. So I'll look over top, making sure I have appropriate, eyewear on, and I'm going to line this up, but I don't want to have the blade against the wood to begin with. If I have the blade against that and I pull the trigger, this again is going to kick on me. So I'm going to line up, but not have the blade against the board, but my guide here on the bottom of the saw needs to be flush on top of the plywood. So I'll start back here, pull the trigger to an appropriate speed, and then engage and start my cut. I'm going to stop halfway and remove this. You can see the splinters are sticking up on this side, but I can tell you that it's much smoother on the underside. Another tip here is notice how I stop the cut, let the blade stop, and then remove the saw. I don't want to have the blade still moving and pull this out of the slot. Again, I can get that kick. If the blade is still coming and I still moving and I pull this out of the slot and it runs down and hits the board again, this will kick back on me. So to finish my cut, slide in. And there we have it. So I can come back, be careful with splinters, come back with a file or sandpaper and knock those splinters smooth. If I were to need a straight cut, I can be reasonably accurate even freehand, but if you want it to be really precise, like if this is going to be part of a wood joint that we want nice and tight, again, I would recommend not using the jig saw. And there's all our splinters. So that's a quick intro on the jig saw or saber saw. Just a reminder to always remove your power source if you're ever handling the blade. When we put these away, I like to have the blade removed, store them elsewhere, and just have the saw put away by itself, then we don't have a sharp object hanging out in the cabinet. The jig saw is a great versatile tool with a lot of flexibility for making a variety of cuts.